Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Rick. The Galactic Empire is far from a perfect political system, and the Imperial Armed Forces was far from a perfect military organization. But for many Imperial citizens, the only way off their terrible backwater planet was to enlist. Now recently we looked at the inner workings of the Imperial Navy and why their officer corps had so many disciplinary issues. Today we'll be continuing our coverage of the Imperial military forces by listing the type of officers you might encounter should you choose to enlist. This way you'll have a better idea on how to deal with your commanding officers and how best to avoid being volunteered for a suicide mission. Keep in mind that most of these officers we'll be talking about will fit in more than just one category. It can be hard to spot in basic training which one of your fellow cadets will truly wilt under fire or become a hero. Sometimes the quiet ones actually are the cowards, and sometimes the loud ones will actually be the heroes, but it's really hard to predict until the blaster bolts actually start flying overhead. But the Glory Hound officer is the type of individual you'll be able to spot from a mile away. There are many types of Glory Hounds, but they generally all love engaging in flashy and very visible frontal attacks. These are individuals that become extremely narrowly focused on obtaining glory and usually forget about the entire battlefield around them. This makes them extremely deadly to be around. Not only are these officers usually pretty incompetent, they're also borderline suicidal or just don't understand what death is. A great example of a Glory Hound officer would be Cassius Constantine, who decided to break formation during the Battle of Autolon with his Interdictor-class Star Destroyer and charge the enemy, which directly led to his own death. Cassius Constantine was jealous and upset that Admiral Thrawn had taken over his command and sought glory for his own selfish gain. Major Staz of the 224th Imperial Armored Division is another example of a Glory Hound. Major Stats, despite being a high-ranking officer, loved to lead his men from the front, and he did so many times during the very deadly Mimbanese campaign, which involved a lot of trench warfare. While Major Stats was most likely beloved by his men, his suicidal frontal assaults against enemy trenches and his insistence that you must go along with him makes him a very dangerous man to be around as well. When high-ranking officers like Major Stas volunteer for the front lines, it's usually the result of an officer who has survived far too many battles and now has a really weird sense of invincibility. This was a common affliction that usually affected seasoned non-commissioned officers and enlisted men that transitioned to become officers. But every now and then you'll also see a higher-ranking officer like Major Stas exhibit the same type of qualities. From the Imperial Academy to the Imperial Navy, it was a dog-eat-dog culture that was amplified by a dark magic evil cult. And while the Imperial Academy naturally attracts some of the most vicious and competitive psychopaths in the galaxy that relish in this type of high-intensity environment, some Imperials have learned how to survive by keeping their heads down. This is a lot harder to do than you would think. Individuals who are weak and do not perform well in the Imperial Academy and Navy will be subjected to shaming and bullying by their peers. But individuals who perform extremely well will also attract the same type of negative attention. Now, the low-key officer needs higher intelligence than your average officer. They need to be disciplined and very good at blending into the various cliques and factions within the Imperial Navy, and succeed at being forgettable but also reliable. While some low-key officers are maintaining a low profile in order to survive, some low-key officers are actually manipulating the circumstances in their own favor. Captain Firmus Piet is a classic example of this. He served under Admiral Kendall Ozzel, who was a relatively stupid officer. Although Piet never openly showed his animosity against Ozzel, he did carefully maneuver against Ozzel, especially in the presence of superior officers like Lord Vader, in order to discredit his commanding officer. Before the Battle of Hoth, Piet purposely calls Ozzel over to his station to interpret new intel gathered from probe droids. Piet knew that Ozzel would probably mess up his analysis of the data, and he also knew that Vader was in the room to see it. Piet also probably knew that Ozzel was going to bring the Death Squadron fleet out of hyperspace too close to Hoth and trigger the Rebel warning system, but he decided not to say anything and let Ozzel dig his own grave. Be mindful of the low-key officer. Should they realize that you have spotted them, they might consider you a threat. But on the other hand, if you do manage to make a friendship with a low-key officer and they are pretty competent, you could go to some pretty high places with them. Although oftentimes being great at maneuvering around within the complicated Imperial military system does not translate into understanding how to maneuver a giant warship.
Piet.
Some officers are going to be able to operate at the next level, to the point where it might seem like their abilities to command are almost magical. These type of officers are able to nonchalantly gain the type of glory that glory hounds dream of, and at the same time rise above the toxic culture within the Imperial military and not lose themselves in all the inner fighting. If you are a loyal Imperial and truly buy into the cause, rest assured if you do have to sacrifice your life, it will most likely be put to good use by the Genius Commander. But more often than not, the Genius Commander will be able to pull off spectacular victories with very few casualties to his own forces. At the same time, the Genius Commander will have to face the most fearsome foes of the Empire at all times. For some soldiers, that's actually not a bad thing. Some individuals believe that if they are going to do something, that they might as well do it better than everyone else. And while the missions might be more dangerous, at least the men alongside you are the most capable as well, because the Genius Commander does not suffer any fools. You might never understand the Genius Officer completely, but if you want to gain his favor, show your own competence and skill and willingness to learn. The Genius Officer does not tolerate sycophants or power-hungry individuals. He wants results. And of course, I'm talking about Grand Admiral Thrawn. He deserves a category all by himself. The good Imperial officer gives us a glimpse of the best parts of the Empire. They believe in the order, stability, and economic prosperity that the Empire can bring the entire galaxy. The good Imperial is fair and actually tries their best to follow the rules set forth to govern the Imperial military. Good Imperials generally have a strong moral compass, and through either luck or just pure talent, they have survived many attempts by the rest of the system to drag them down. What makes serving under a good Imperial so great is that they generally are pretty reasonable and fair to serve under. Even the most authoritarian and evil regimes on our own planet have constitutions and laws that seem reasonable, but the difference is they don't actually follow them. But the good Imperial is a law-abiding officer, which means no random executions, and as long as you don't step out of line, you should do pretty well underneath their command. The good Imperial officer will also fight for his or her men, but the good Imperial officer might butt heads with more corrupt and ambitious officers, and should things not go their way, the consequences could also affect those underneath their command. Admiral Ray Sloan was a good example of this type of officer. Growing up in poverty and around crime, Ray Sloan became a model Imperial officer and was dedicated to bringing security to the Empire. In the post-Endor Empire, Ray Sloan was one of the few bright spots in the Imperial military, and for a short period of time, she became the highest ranking officer of the scattered Imperial remnant forces. Hers was a unique and rare story. Generally, good Imperials will ultimately see their idea of the Empire challenged by the actions of others within the Empire. Most good Imperials become disillusioned with the Empire either after the destruction of Alderaan or during Operation Cinder, where the late Emperor tasked Imperial forces to destroy entire worlds for no strategic reason. Ida Versio is the classic example of a good Imperial who eventually defected. She had led the Imperial Special Forces unit known as Inferno Squad, but turned right after the destruction of her homeworld by her own father, a high-ranking ISB officer that was drafted into Operation Cinder. Other good Imperials, like General Maximilian Veers, commander of Blizzard Force, were heavily focused on their jobs and continued to survive and excel within the Imperial military because of their excellence and dedication. These soldiers completely isolated themselves and protected themselves from all the politics within the Imperial military through an excellent combat record. There are very ambitious individuals who are also very confident about their own abilities, but then there are ambitious individuals who are not as confident about themselves. These are individuals who want power but realize they lack the ability to seize it for themselves and instead grovel at the feet of superior officers to the point where it makes people uncomfortable. The Sycophant agrees with everything that their superior officer says and will also be the first one to attack anyone who attacks their commanding officer. And while they're constantly sucking up to their superior officer, they are vicious and callous to the men and women below them and seek to suppress them. Sycophants are selfish, insecure, and generally a pain to be around. Should you encounter a Sycophant officer or serve under a Sycophant officer in the middle of a battle, your best option is probably to throw a detonator in their general direction and then just hope for the best. A few officers within the ranks of the Imperial Navy actually had served the Grand Army of the Republic during the Clone Wars. Now, these seasoned veterans brought a more unique and long-term view of what the Empire was. Having grown up in a free republic and seeing its failures and ultimate transition to the Empire meant that these officers have experienced both systems and seen the pros and cons of both of these systems. These officers were also smart enough not to say anything too positive about the Republic or the old ways of doing things. After all of the officers that did that were probably purged during the transitional period. But that doesn't mean that the old Navy officer won't take lessons they learned from the Clone Wars and apply them to the current situation. General Brendel Hux is an example of an old Navy officer. As the instructor in charge of a major Imperial academy, he sought to recreate the discipline and skill of the clone soldiers and Jedi officers in his own cadets. He would eventually be responsible for creating the First Order Stormtrooper training program, which started training their troopers from birth. Admiral Wolf Yularen was another old Navy officer. He used his experience from previous wars to mentor and advise talented Imperials like Thrawn and Agent Kallus. Another old Navy officer would be Moff Tarkin. Like many of the old Navy officers who had decided to transition to the Empire, he remembered the chaos that was partly allowed to happen thanks to the Republic's lack of a strong central military. He was willing to sacrifice entire planets in order to prevent the Empire from reverting to its old ways. The old Navy officer can be a great individual to learn from. If you manage to gain their confidence, they might even inform you on what the Republic was like without any filters from the Imperial censors. The old Navy officer has either learned enough tricks to survive or has gathered enough influence to have a considerable amount of power to help him survive. Either way, serving beneath an old Navy officer is generally a good career path, although personalities vary from one individual to another. Also, never mistaken the old Navy officer for being pro-Republic. There's a reason why they're still alive, and that's because they chose the winning side. So I hope this little guide of Imperial officers does help you kind of better transition into a role as an enlisted soldier within the Imperial military forces. But again, these are just stereotypes, and there are always going to be individuals that go against these definitions, so keep that in mind. Anyway guys, stay safe, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. And as usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.